Hello, everyone. We are now in part 5 of the video series in which I read for your benefit my English translation, Beyond Good and Evil, Prelude to a Philosophy of the Future by Friedrich Nietzsche. I have translated this text from the German. This is a new English translation. And today I'm going to be reading from paragraph 45 of the text until paragraph 55 of the text. And this is the 5th video, video number 5, in the 15-part video series in which I recite for your benefit my English translation of the book and lecture on the text intermittently from time to time. So let's just begin. I have some remarks to make before I actually recite the translation. So let me just make a few remarks just to put what you're going to be listening to in context. So we continue. Nietzsche writes quite a bit about Pascal in this section, right? We are now in section 3 of the book, which is entitled The Religious Essence. That is how it should be translated, by the way. It's translated in all kinds of foolish ways in other English translations. No, the religious essence. Anyway, Pascal, the French philosopher Pascal, the religious thinker Pascal. Well, there is no question that Pascal was a polymath. This is the person who invented the calculator. He was a brilliant mathematician as well as a religious thinker. But he only became a religious thinker circa 1654, I believe, when he had a near-death experience. Now, some scholars contest this. They say that it is merely a rumor, but I would like to believe in it, out of faith, perhaps. So he apparently had a near-death experience in 1654. He nearly collided with a horse-drawn carriage. Now, this anecdote is disputed by some scholars, as I said, but I like to believe in it out of faith, right? So after this near collision, which was a midnightly collision, it happened around midnight, he devoted his intellect to God and became, as I said, a religious intellectual, a Christian intellectual. Some claim that the term religious intellectual is an instance of antiphrasis, such as can be found in the most lamentable and excellent tragedy of Romeo and Juliet by Shakespeare. You know, cold fire, sick health, you have a clash of oppositions. And I don't necessarily believe that, though. I don't necessarily believe that. Not at all. But Pascal pledged his mind to Christianity and to the Christian deity, the Christian God. He was terrified of scientific revolutions, the scientific revolutions that were going on at that time, in the 17th century, such as those occasioned by the discoveries of Copernicus and Galileo. But the real intellectual scandal was not that we no longer live in a geocentric cosmos, right? As we know, we live in a heliocentric cosmos, rather. No, the real intellectual scandal, the real intellectual horror show, is that we do not live in a closed world, but rather in infinite space. And as we know, we live in infinitely ever-expanding space, which is terrifying. It's terrifying. Now, in the posthumously published notebooks entitled Pensées, Thoughts, Pascal writes, the eternal silence of these infinite faces, the eternal silence of these infinite spaces terrifies me. So there was a sense in which Pascal recoiled, shrunk back from scientific discovery. And one might argue that there is a limitation to his thought. Nietzsche certainly is making this argument, as we'll see. But the point that I want to make is that Pascal used his prodigious intellect to ratify the basic principles of Christianity. Indeed, Pascal paved the way for Kierkegaard with his leap of faith, and his leap of faith, Kierkegaard's leap of faith, right? there is a point, I think it's fair to say, at which faith is irrational, right? Faith is unreasonable. At a certain point, it's irrational. There is a point at which you cannot intellectually justify your faith. There's a point at which you can no longer logically ratify your faith, right? Faith means believing without any reason to believe. Believing what you believe, even though there is no reason to believe it. And that's fine. That's fine. But that is exactly the domain of faith, which is not the domain of logic, right? I think we know that now. Not believing, or faith is not believing despite the fact that there is no evidence to support your belief, but believing because there is no evidence to support your belief. Faith is the spitefulness toward evidence in any form, whether artificial evidence, as Aristotle would put it, I'm translating from the Greek, right? Artificial evidence means logic, basically, logical reasons, or inartificial evidence, to channel Aristotle, which is empirical evidence, research, right? So think of it that way. Thus, faith cannot be intellectually grounded, and Pascal knows this. Pascal believed in the heart. The heart knows what it knows, right? There is a kind of logic of the heart that Pascal endorsed, and I'm not condemning Pascal for this. I'm just trying to set up Nietzsche's argument so that it's more audible, so it's more legible, so it's more comprehensible. So Pascalian faith is really believing with the heart than with the head. You believe because you believe, in other words. Okay, let me move on to the Pascalian wager, about which quite a bit has been said and written. So many of you are already familiar, I'm sure, with the Pascalian wager. You've heard it in some form, you've read it in some form. So the Pascalian wager, this is the problem with the Pascalian wager, which is truly a form of intellectual suicide, to canalize Nietzsche. So essentially, this is a way of turning faith into God, or I should say, this is a way of turning faith in God into a casino. A game at a casino at which the faithful gamble. It is a way of gambling one's faith, but the game is rigged in advance. Now, in its most basic form, this is the Pascalian wager. Just believe in God, you have nothing to lose. If you don't believe in God, you might have everything to lose. Now, I have heard theologians, I have heard Catholic priests criticize this phony argument, because it is a phony argument. I'm not bashing anyone's religion. Again, priests have criticized this fake argument, this bogus, phony argument. I've heard Catholics criticize this bogus argument. One of the most bogus arguments ever put forward. One of the most phony arguments ever set forward. It really is a fake argument from beginning to end. Now, why? And I'm going to get into that in a minute, though. Why? But I am almost certain that Nietzsche was thinking of this pseudo-argument when he writes about the suicide of reason orchestrated by Pascal. Now, some have claimed that the Pascalian wager is a legitimation of hypocrisy. Christopher Hitchens has said this, and so indeed it is. But that's not my argument against it, if you're interested. I'm going to talk about this in just a minute. My objection, however, is that I don't choose what I believe. I believe what I believe. So I'm, in a way, I mean, I do agree with Pascal in other pages of his work. You know, I believe what I believe, right? My belief has its own logic. But don't try to give a specious or spurious justification or the belief of your heart. That's where Pascal gets himself into great difficulty. He falls down the pitfall. He precipitates into the pitfall at this point. So quite simply, I believe whatever I am persuaded to believe in by the force of evidence, or perhaps by the force of intuition. That's fine. If I am convinced that something is true, then I am convinced that something is true. I accept it as real. I accept it as valid. I accept it as true. Now, I don't desire to believe in something and then pre-program my mind to believe in that thing. Belief is not a matter of auto brainwashing, but Pascal thinks that faith is a matter of free will and also a matter of desire. It is not. It is not. Now, I find this idea repellent and false. It is a kind of intellectual miscarriage. And I do agree with Nietzsche on this point. I'm going to pause for just a moment and then come back. So after his near collision with a horse-drawn carriage at midnight, Pascal, and this happened again in the summer of 1654, Pascal becomes an intellectual charlatan. Charlatan, I should say, that's the correct pronunciation, with his talk of the logic of the heart, the non-intellectual faith of the heart, his terror before the measurelessness of space, the infinitude of space, the endlessness of space, the immeasurable vastness of illimitable space. And the wager, which no serious theologian takes seriously, which even Catholic priests have refuted, as I've said, and which indeed, to paraphrase Nietzsche, is a protracted self-sacrifice of the intellect. We will see that in just a few minutes. So this is the real line that Pascal crosses, according to Nietzsche. This is the real line that he crosses. Pascal's whimpering that, and I'm going to have Simone read this French passage out loud. One moment. One moment. One moment, just a moment.
Le moi est haïssable.
Merci, Simone. Merci bien. I hope you could hear her say that. Transliterated, that means the me is hateable, right? That is from Pascal. The deadliest of all sins in Christianity is pride. And this outrages Nietzsche. If you've read Also sprach Zarathustra, you'll know why. I'll get to that in a minute. But Nietzsche is scandalized by the slander against human dignity, against self-worth or the feeling of self-worth, self-love, which is inherent to the diabolization of pride, which is occasioned in Pascal, right? Which appears in Pascal, I should say. Now, if you've read Also sprach Zarathustra, thus spoke Zarathustra, you will know that Zarathustra teaches human beings to love themselves, albeit not in a spiritualistic, mystical, shopping mall, new age way. But yes, I mean, that is one of Zarathustra's teachings. Love yourself. Learn to love yourself. Now, the human animal, the human beast, should learn to love itself, not despite all of its ugliness, its darkness, its flaws, but because of all of its ugliness, darkness, and flaws, right? Only after such a self-recognition, right, self-acknowledgement, will humankind rise to its greatest height. That's Nietzsche's argument in a nutshell, right? If you've read Also sprach Zarathustra, you know all about this. So this is why Nietzsche deposes, dethrones, overthrows many of the so-called virtues. He suggests, for example, that meekness should not be angelized and stellified, right? Don't raise meekness up to the sky. No. It should not be lionized. It should not be stellified to the status of a virtue, according to Nietzsche, not me, just according to Nietzsche. Meekness should not be considered as a transcendent absolute good, according to Nietzsche. Meekness shows a deficiency in the intellect or spirit, to use Nietzsche's term, which of course is Geist, right? Geist is one of the key words in German philosophy and German thought in the 18th century, but also in the 19th century, in which Nietzsche is writing. But anyway, Meekness shows deficiency in the intellect, according to Nietzsche. Conversely, we should elevate some of the vices. Hashtag not all vices, but some of the vices, right? We should beatify some of the vices, which are not as vicious as modern culture makes them out to be. So there is nothing wrong with pride, for example, according to Nietzsche. There's nothing wrong with pride. There's nothing wrong with pride. Pride is the feeling that you are everything and that the admiration of others, the potential admiration of others, is nothing. You are everything and the potential admiration of others is nothing. That is a definition of pride. You are substantial, right? You have dignity, regardless, irrespective of what anyone else says about you. Vanity, by contrast, is the feeling that you are nothing and that the admiration of everyone else is everything. And unfortunately, this is a reasonable yet incomplete definition of narcissism. Narcissism is a bit different. I mean, narcissistic people are vain. But let me just say this, is that narcissism in a nutshell is the state of mind in which one demands love from others, from everyone, really, but one refuses to give love in return. And a narcissist is someone who thinks, by helping me, you're helping yourself. Why don't you want to help me? Why don't you want to help me? A narcissist is also someone who is very verbally abusive. Very verbally abusive. Narcissists will put you down all the time. They'll put you down. They'll put you down all the time, right? In order to feel their own power. And narcissists don't actually love themselves. What they're afraid of is the slippage of their mask. I have to say, not the literal mask, because right now we're still living through the quarantine. We're struggling through a quarantine because of COVID-19. No, I mean like a metaphorical mask. They're afraid that their masks will slip. Anyway, I don't want to get off topic. I'm being tangential right now. I'm sorry about that. But the feeling of the proud is that they are everything, and their refusal to allow themselves to be treated disrespectfully might become a kind of vaingloriousness, it is true, which is a problem, But why should pride be considered a vice? No one can tell Nietzsche that. No one can tell Nietzsche that. Why should pride be a vice? I can see why vanity is a vice, but why should pride be considered a vice? Again, if it becomes vaingloriousness, that could be easily considered a vice, but what about pride in itself? Why is that a vice? And this is Nietzsche's inaugural attack on traditional morality. And if you want to read about that, read Nietzsche's great book. It's usually translated as Daybreak, Thoughts on the Prejudices of Morality. You definitely should read that book if you haven't read it yet. I mean, I would say read it many times. It's a great book. It's an underestimated book by Nietzsche. Anyway, so Nietzsche is suggesting that religion meekens and weakens the human being, the human beast, the human animal, by praising self-abnegation, right? Self-renunciation, self-hatred, self-debasement, self-humiliation, lowliness, as if the earth belonged to the meek, and the kingdom of heaven would be given to those who abase themselves. As I wrote someplace else, and then the meek shall inherit the earth, right? Fine. This is something that Nietzsche cannot abide, however. Nietzsche cannot abide this thought, not at all. Far from it. He cannot tolerate even the idea of self-hatred on the part of a human being, right? Nietzsche cannot tolerate the idea that any human being would hate itself, right? I'm using the gender-neutral form for obvious reasons. So if anything, Nietzsche wants to inspirit the dispirited and the broken-spirited. He is a positive, life-affirmative thinker, despite the media cliches and tabloid stereotypes about him. Okay, let me just pause for a moment. I enjoy pointing out some of Nietzsche's mistakes because, not to be a fault-finding jerk, but because I believe that even when Nietzsche makes an error, it is a productive error. So Nietzsche is very fond of quoting Tertullian, one of the church fathers, right? One of the fathers of the Church of Rome. Tertullian, irrespective of what Nietzsche says about him, what Nietzsche claims, writes, I believe it because it is inept. Tertullian never actually writes, I believe it because it is absurd. So Nietzsche mistranslates and miscites Tertullian. This is a good example of the Mandela effect. So again, Tertullian never actually wrote, I believe it because it is absurd. No, Tertullian wrote, I believe it because it is inept, which is not the same thing. But I like Nietzsche's miscitation. Again, whenever Nietzsche makes a mistake, it's a productive mistake. Now, moderns, this is something else that Nietzsche is hinting at. Moderns do not understand the significance of the cross, right? They do not brood over the meaning of the cross. I mean, try to imagine people on the train. I know very few people take the train these days. Someone on the bus or someone on an airplane. Do you really think that all those people, even though they profess to be Christians, this is largely a Christian nation if we're talking about the United States of America, and many other nations are Christian as well. But do you really believe that people are brooding over the paradox of the cross, the meaning of the cross, which is a paradox? I doubt they are. Maybe they are. I think they're playing Candy Crush or Fall Guys or Animal Crossings or whatever they're doing. But God is infinite and eternal, right? God is infinite and eternal, and yet God is humanized as Jesus, who is then crucified. Think about it. So the infinite is finitized, the eternal is temporalized, and the divine is anthropomorphized and mortalized, right? The crucifix, this means, is a paradox. Again, the crucifix is a paradox, for it signifies the finitization of the infinite and the temporalization of the eternal, right? And the mortalization of the immortal. But isn't that a paradox? Maybe it's even a self-contradiction. I don't know. I would say it's probably a paradox, right? The idea of a limited God, the idea of a finite God, the idea of a God who can die seems paradoxical to me, at least. Let me go into something else now. I want to repeat this point I made earlier because I think it's worth thinking about. I haven't taken public transport in a while, since all of us are struggling through a quarantine that was incurred by the terrible pestilence known as COVID-19. But if you do take the train during rush hour, do you really believe that all of the yuppies who you see are brooding over their immortal souls? Do you think they're thinking about their immortal souls? Do you really? Do you really think they are contemplating the meaning of the cross? Do you think they're thinking about Jesus and the crucifixion, even if they profess to be Christians? And yet most Americans consider themselves to be Christians, according to the polls, according to the Gallup and the Pew polls that I've read. But how Christian are they while they are engrossed in their iPhones? I ask you that. One moment. Now, Nietzsche is alluding to something that he will explain fully in On the Genealogy of Morality. The noble, the powerful, nominate themselves as the good, right? Whereas the poor, the oppressed, are designated by the higher classes as the bad. An inversion of values comes with the ascendancy of the priestly class. The noble will now be renamed as the evil, and the poor will rename themselves as the good. What enrages the slave is not the sadism of the aristocrat. What the slave cannot stand is the blithe unconcernedness, the superb indifference, the superior nonchalance, the ironical playfulness of the aristocrat, the emperor, the patrician, the lord, etc., etc. This is what drives the slave insane. This is what drives the slave mad. and catalyzes the slave's wrath and propels the slave to insurrections, such as the French Revolution, right? This book was only written around 97 years after the French Revolution. That wasn't a very long time. This book was written in 1886, 97 years after the French Revolution, in Oberengadin, Switzerland, which is 788 kilometers from Paris, right? Nietzsche must have experienced the seismic resonance, or at least the seismic reverberations of the French Revolution. Consider that. By the way, if you're interested in reading, or if you're interested in listening to my lectures on the genealogy of morality, they are available. I have a 3-part video series dedicated to Nietzsche's On the Genealogy of Morality. If you are interested, I created a video on this book. Anyway, that will be Nietzsche's next book, by the way. His next book is On the Genealogy of Morality. Anyway, so the plebeian, right, thinks in absolutes. You know, the lower class person thinks in absolutes. The plebeian thinks unconditionally, right? The plebeian only thinks in categories of good or evil. The plebeian has the attitude, I am good because you are evil. I am good because you are evil. You are evil, therefore I am good. Now, the imputed evil, in quotes, of the patrician, the person who comes from the upper classes, the aristocracy, the nobility, is the condition for the plebeian's feeling of one's own so-called goodness, right? They are evil, therefore I am good. It is not so much that the upper classes, the aristocracy, are malicious or sadistic, once more. It is that they do not care. They are indifferent. Okay. Of all the ancient thinkers, I would argue, Epicurus is the closest to Nietzsche, at least in this book and also in The Gay Science, which you should definitely read. Also translated as The Joyful Wisdom, Die fröhliche Wissenschaft. Anyway, and if you read The Gay Science and you read this book, you'll notice a very close proximity between Nietzsche and Epicurus. Anyway, it is not that Epicurus denies the existence of the supernatural, as is sometimes said about him. It is that he thinks that the gods are unconcerned with us. The gods don't care about us, right? From a probabilistic perspective, extraterrestrials might very well exist. Think of the Fermi paradox, right? It is probabilistically true that extraterrestrials, aliens, exist, right? But if they do exist, why would they be concerned with us? Why would the gods be concerned with us? Answer me that. All we may say of the gods from this perspective is that they are absolutely otherwise than this world in which we are. They are the photographic negative of this world. Now, the places, this place is really Epicurus and Nietzsche in the most intimate proximity to the Lurianic Kabbalah, right? If you read the Kabbalah, the Lurianic Kabbalah, you will know that God is En Sof, or perhaps it would be pronounced Ein Sof. Ein Sof, I'll pronounce it that way. Ein Sof means no end, right? And to Gnosticism, right, Nietzsche is in closer proximity to Gnosticism, Gnostic Christianity, than anyone might have thought, and to other forms of apophatic theology than one would customarily acknowledge. Apophatic means the negative way. Apophatic theology is negative theology, right? Anyway, let me pause for just a minute. In another passage, as you will soon hear, Nietzsche writes of the paroxysms, the spasms of world negation that beset those who desire fervently the annihilation of the world. It's very interesting. We'll get to that. We'll get to that in a few minutes. Anyway, let's talk about miracles now in Nietzsche. So what is a miracle? Well, a miracle is the suspension, the rupture, the interruption, or disruption of descriptive or prescriptive natural law. The first instance of a rainbow is miraculous. The first instance of a rainbow is miraculous. The first time that human eyes ever beheld a rainbow, it was perceived as miraculous. And indeed it was miraculous. It was a miracle. But science brings things down to the level of comprehensibility, right? Science demotes things to the level of the comprehensibly human. To scientific eyes, a rainbow is a stratum of moisture against which sunlight refracts, right? Creating an iridescent sheen. So that's not a miracle anymore. I mean, we normally don't think of a rainbow as miraculous, do we? What about birth? Is birth a miracle? Now, there is a branch of science known as embryology, right? And approximately 360,000 human beings are brought into this world every single day. Each day, 360,000 human beings approximately are born. So how could human birth then, a process which is scientifically explicated and so common as to be regular, if not routine, be considered a miracle? Now, it is remarkable. I'll allow that. But is it miraculous? If an elephant gave birth to a mouse, that would rightly be regarded as a miracle, since it has never been known to happen before. But if elephants regularly gave birth to mice, would that be a miracle then? Would we regard the birth of mice from the bodies of elephants as miraculous then? Would we? Now, we all know from Schopenhauer that the will is foundational, right? The will is irreducible. And Nietzsche affirms the will to will, right? And if you've read On the Genealogy of Morality, which I strongly recommend that you read, and again, if you're interested, if not, that's fine. But if you're interested, I have dedicated 3 videos to the great book of Nietzsche entitled On the Genealogy of Morality, also translated as On the Genealogy of Morals. Please listen and watch my videos. But anyway, if you don't want to, that's fine too. But anyway, for Nietzsche, the will generates meaning. And this is not really something that Schopenhauer suggests. If anything, I mean, the will is pre-semantic for Schopenhauer. The will is pre-semiotic. If anything, the will is not a generator of meaning for Schopenhauer, but it is for Nietzsche. It is for Nietzsche. So the will would rather will nothingness than not will at all, to channel Nietzsche's On the Genealogy of Morality. Okay, so let us pretend now, for the purposes of argument, that there is such a person as a saint. And another type of person, such as a sinner. I'm not saying that there is, I'm not saying that there isn't. But let's just pretend, for the purposes of argument, that there exists a type of human being known as a sinner. Let us also pretend, for the purposes, or suppose, for the purposes of argument, that there is a type of person whom we would call a saint. Fine, fine, fine. Why is one not the obverse of the other? Why do they not belong to the same system dialectically? To say that they are polarized, right, would be to commit an intellectual error. To assert that they are antithetical would be to draw an artificial distinction. What I'm trying to say is, for Nietzsche, the saint and the sinner are not absolutely other, right? They belong to the same system. Nietzsche is again asking us to take affects, inner experiences, states of mind that are traditionally considered to be negative, such as pride, such as ambition, right? Such as selfishness, and valorize them, vaunt them, elevate them, lionize them, angelize them, stellify them, right? Perhaps some of the so-called vices are not so bad, and perhaps some of the virtues are not so virtuous. Here is another Nietzschean inversion, although this one doesn't get talked about as much as the whole good versus bad and good versus evil dichotomies. So, the morality of opposing values contaminates psychology and philosophy, according to Nietzsche. This is not myself, this is Nietzsche. Such opposing values as good and evil are merely inherited oppositions, ghosts of the mind, to canalize Max Stirner, whom Nietzsche certainly read. If you've ever read the book translated as The Ego and Its Own, The I and Its Property by Max Stirner, you'll know what I mean. These are inherited concepts, which are then transferred onto the world as if they were really existing things or really existing characteristics of people. But according to Stirner, they are not, and according to Nietzsche, they are not. And Nietzsche goes much further than Stirner ever did. Anyway, here's another question. Why have the most powerful people bowed down, supplicated themselves before the ascetic? Why is that? Marcus Aurelius, one of Rome's most benevolent Caesars, according to historical record, prostrated himself before the slave Epictetus, right? Marcus knew the insignificance of wealth and of power. He knew that wealth is meaningless. He knew that power is meaningless. All that he admired was one thing, and that thing is wisdom. It did not matter to him through which vector that wisdom was transmitted. It did not matter in which vessel that wisdom was contained. Alexander the Great, after having been slighted by the half-naked, homeless, barrel-dwelling philosopher Diogenes Laertes, said to his soldiers as he was riding away, "If I were not Alexander, I would like to be Diogenes." You see, so Alexander the Great, who was the most powerful human being in the known world at that time, admired Diogenes, the philosopher slave, the homeless philosopher. Then there's the more recent example of Francois Duvalier, right? The former president of Haiti, supplicating before Mother Teresa, right? Isn't it interesting how many very, very powerful leaders bowed down before the saints? Interesting, isn't it? Why is this? Well, Nietzsche wonders this. The potentate is overawed by the self-abstention, the self-denial of the ascetic, and wonders, why would you give up so much pleasure? Why? My categories of understanding cannot be applied to this phenomenon. The unworldliness of the ascetic, the giving up of sensuous pleasures, is mystifying to me. I don't understand it. And then the powerful leader wanted to find out why. Why is it that the saint is giving up so much pleasure? Because this is the case for most human beings. If you give up something precious, don't you have the expectation of receiving something in exchange, in return? Otherwise, why would you do it? How is it rational? This is how most people think. And so the powerful leaders thought to themselves, well, surely the saint has some kind of motive, some kind of agenda, to use a word that we use today in that sense. So let's talk about the Emperor Constantine. Could it be that the Emperor Constantine, who converted to Christianity famously and founded the first Christian empire, making Byzantium the new seat of the Roman Empire, right? This was Christian Rome. Constantine inaugurated Christian Rome. Could it be that Emperor Constantine I, was under the sway of an ascetic as well? Could it be that he was in awe of the power of the saint? It would explain quite a bit, wouldn't it? Nietzsche does not explicitly pose this question, but it ought to be posed. Christianity transmuted from the religion of the powerless to the religion of the powerful. Some of us are old enough to remember the television mega preachers of the 1980s and the 1990s, such as Jim Bakker, with his apocalyptic feed buckets, and Jerry Falwell. Do you remember him, if you're old enough? With his suspicious anti-homosexualism. Many of them had a gospel of affluence. The more money that I fleece from you, my bleeding flock, the more I can advertise my gospel of self-aggrandizement. Such was the defense of their gross accumulation of wealth. Let me turn to another point now. Nietzsche, this might surprise some people. It might be surprising to some that Nietzsche praises the Hebraic Bible, not the so-called Christian Bible, right? The so-called New Testament is a mere appendix and should have been published separately, according to Nietzsche. All right, let's get into another topic. I know I'm being very fragmentary, but this is my commentary on the text that I'm going to be reading for you in just a moment. Paragraph 45 to 55 of Beyond Good and Evil, Prelude to a Philosophy of the Future. All metaphysics is religious. After all, it holds that there exists another world, a world other than the world in which we find ourselves, a supra-sensible world. Metaphysics, like religion, is preoccupied with a stable, immutable, extra-worldly foundation. Okay, let me pause for just a moment. Now, normally we believe that the thinker comes first and then the thoughts come second, right? Normally we think that there is a thinking self, right, who thinks thoughts, right? That's how we think. That's what we believe, I should say, to avoid confusion. First, there is a human being who thinks, and that human being produces thoughts. But what if it were the other way around, right? What if thinking were the condition and the cogito, right, the thinking thing, is super added to the process of thinking? What if thinking preceded the I that thinks? What if the I were superimposed unto the activity of thinking? Perhaps the self, the subject, is a grammatical fiction. The I is a hypostasized synthesis, according to Nietzsche, right? So first there is the thinking, and then the thinker comes afterwards, right? Now, I don't want to get too deep into this, but Blanchot does something very interesting. According to Blanchot, there is no writer before writing, right? It's not as if the writer writes. No, the work of literature gives birth to the writer, not the other way around. So that all comes from Nietzsche. That all comes from Nietzsche, right? So Nietzsche writes of Kant, the possibility of a phenomenal subject might not have been foreign to him, right? So this is what Nietzsche is writing about Kant. And it wasn't foreign to him. It wasn't foreign to Kant. The possibility of a phenomenal subject was not foreign to Kant. Kant writes of what he calls auto-affection in the transcendental aesthetic of the Critique of Pure Reason, the first critique, Die Kritik der reinen Vernunft. Now, in both editions, if you read the 1781 edition of the Critique of Pure Reason and the 1787 edition of the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant writes of the self having a feeling for itself, self-affection, right? If everything that we perceive is subject to the universal condition of sensibility, which is time, right? According to Kant, time is the universal condition of sensibility. Everything is an appearance. This means that the self is an appearance to itself. The self phenomenalizes itself. Right? Okay. Let me pause for just a moment. We'll come right back. I am going to devote an entire video to Nietzsche's eternal recurrence of the same, to Nietzsche's doctrine of the eternal recurrence of the same. And I expatiate on the theory of the eternal recurrence in the next video in the series. It's over there, or it's over there, it's over there, I don't know. But the next video in this series, I'll expatiate a bit on the eternal recurrence of the same. I just want to make one comment just to prepare you for my remarks. The so-called Vedanta philosophy, by which Nietzsche and Schopenhauer mean Hinduism, what we now call Hinduism, inspired Nietzsche, in particular the Nietzschean thought experiment known as the eternal recurrence of the same. Now, what am I thinking of? I'm thinking of the Hindu concept, that might not be the right word, but the Hindu concept of samsara, as is said. I'll talk about that later. Okay. Something else. The near sacrifice of Isaac at the hands of Abraham, right? And then we can go back further, right? The sacrifice of Ivaginea. The sacrifice of Ivaginea. The sacrifice of children to the demon god Moloch. The sacrifice of children in so many religions, in so many rituals, was too barbarous, too unsophisticated, too undignified for the ancient Romans, who were always forename. Now that's going to be a very important word for an understanding of this book. Forename is a word, again, that I translate variously as dignified, sophisticated, distinguished, distinctive. You know, there are many ways of translating it, but it's all context specific. I'm not a simplistic translator. I don't translate one signified as one word. I don't translate that way. I'm not a transliterator. I'm a translator. I don't translate signifieds. I translate signifiers. The sacrifice of children is translated into quadragesilism. No, quadragesimalism. No, that is right. Quadragesimalism, right? The sacrificing of one's nature, one's physical inclinations through fasting, right? During Lent, right? Celibacy is not mentioned, but it might as well have been. Parenthetically, if you're interested in an excellent but very, very troubling film about, it's like a reinterpretation of the sacrifice of Ivaginea myth. See The Killing of a Sacred Deer from 2017. But do not see this film if disturbing content makes you squirmy. This is not a film for the squirmy, right? But the myth of Agamemnon's sacrifice of Ivaginea is reinterpreted in the film The Killing of a Sacred Deer from 2017. All right, a few more things and then I'll get into the translation itself. So look, once you start worshiping rocks, pieces of wood, material objects such as relics, the belief in the god might actually be preserved. Now, the avatar for the god would be merely regarded as a paltry effigy, if one regards it ironically, as if it were a disguise that the god wears, right? Well, this is just a rock. It's not really the god. You know, it's not really the god itself. You could still be a believer and regard the rock as nothing more than not a symbol, but an effigy of the god, right? This, you could regard the rock or the piece of wood, ironically, as if it were merely the disguise, the guise that the god wears. The mask conceals, yet reveals at the same time. Now, everyone knows that the relic doesn't directly represent or transmit the divine, but this might be one way of preserving the supernatural. But there is another outcome of worshiping rocks and pieces of wood. If you reduce the divine to an effigy, belief in the god will die. So Nietzsche's cosmeticization of the mask, his glorification of the mask, is continuous with his thinking, especially in this book. For Nietzsche, remember, appearance is being. Appearance is being. Now, if you don't know what I mean by that, go back and listen to and watch video 1 in this series. Appearances being. Appearances are all that we have. Now for Kant, well, Kant was wrong. Kant was wrong. For Kant, there is no thing in itself outside of human perception. Nietzschean phenomenology is a phenomenological ontology. All right, but let's get back to the main point. So in language, according to Nietzsche, whenever you name something, that thing dies. You see this in Hegel. You see this in Hegel. You see this in Blanchot, right? Whenever you name something, that thing dies. If I say that it is 6:47 p.m. now, which it is, in a minute it won't be. In a minute it won't be. And in other places of the world, I'm on Central Standard Time now, it is not 6:47 p.m., right? Language quickly grows stale depending on where you are and when you are. Words no longer name the thing that was indicated. Language kills off the referent in order to signify anything at all. Perhaps, this is the main point I'm trying to make, perhaps by naming the divine, one kills the divine. Perhaps by naming the divine, we kill the divine. God is dead, according to Nietzsche. Why? By fetishizing the relic, by investing it imaginarily with supernatural properties, one kills the supernatural. And this happens in the modern world. When Nietzsche writes God is dead, he does not mean that literally. No. God is dead in the modern world because God is depth. God is dead because God is depth. And in the modern world, we don't believe in depth anymore. Nietzsche is gleefully anticipating the assassination of the supernatural as he is welcoming the coming philosophers, if we may even use the word philosophers. Nietzsche's imaginary friends, the free spirits, would be pleased. Those to whom he writes and for whom he writes, those who have not yet been born and will only be born long after he is gone. All right, thank you. My name again is Joseph Suglia, Suglia, and that was my lecture on paragraph 45 to paragraph 55 of Beyond Good and Evil by Prelude to a Philosophy of the Future by Friedrich Nietzsche. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to be reading for you my English translation from paragraph 45 to paragraph 55. Thank you very much. So in just a moment, I'll be reciting for you, mostly without commentary. I might make one comment or another. I'm going to be reading for you my English translation of the book. Paragraph 45. The human soul and its limitations. The entire extent of human inner experience that has been reached thus far, the heights, the depths, the distances of these experiences, the entire former history of the soul, and all of the possibilities that have not yet been drunken down. These are the predetermined hunting grounds of an innate psychologist and friend of the great hunt. But how often must he say to himself, or she say to herself, despairingly, only one person? Ah, nothing more than one person, and this vast forest, this primeval forest. And so one wishes for 100 hunting aids and finely trained bloodhounds that one could drive into the history of the human soul in order to get one's prey in order. In vain, one finds again and again, thoroughly and bitterly, how hard it is to find assistants and hounds for the very things that pique one's curiosity. The difficulty with sending scholars out into new and dangerous hunting grounds, where courage, cleverness and refinement in every sense are needed, is that they are no longer useful precisely where the great danger begins, with the great hunt. It is right there where they lose their eyes and noses for tracking quarry. In order to figure out and to establish the kind of history, the problem of knowledge and conscience had in the soul of the hominis religiosi, the religious people. One would have to have perhaps an intellectual conscience, just as deep, as wounded, as monstrous as the intellectual conscience of Pascal. And then one would need an expansive heaven of bright, malicious intellectuality from which to survey, order, and force into formulae this chaos of dangerous and painful experiences. But who is there to do me this service? They are improbable in every age. Ultimately, one has to do it oneself in order to know even a single thing. That means there is much to be done. But curiosity of my style remains the most pleasant of all vices. Pardon me, I should say instead, the love of truth has its reward in heaven and also on earth. Paragraph 46. The sort of faith that the first Christendom required and not seldom achieved within a skeptical, southern, and free-spirited world, a world that had a century-long battle between schools of philosophy behind it, and within it, to say nothing of the lesson in tolerance given by the Imperium Romanum. This faith is not the true-hearted and barbarous faith of the slave, to which northern barbarians such as Luther and Cromwell attached God and Christendom. This original faith is much closer to Pascal's faith, which in a terrible manner resembles the extended suicide of a reason that cannot be killed off immediately and in a single blow. Christian faith is sacrifice from its inception. The sacrifice of all liberty, the sacrifice of all pride, the sacrifice of all self-confidence of spirit. At the same time, it is enslavement and self-mockery, self-mangling. There is cruelty and a religious Phoenicianism in this faith, and a religious Phoenicianism in this faith. One that presumes a brittle, multitudinous, and well-spoiled conscience. Its presupposition is that the subjugation of spirit is indescribably painful, that the entire past and all of the habits of such a spirit turns against the absurdissimum, which is presented as faith. Modern people, with all their inurement to all Christian nomenclature, are no longer sympathetic to the dreadful superlative that was inherent, according to ancient tastes, in the paradox of the God on the cross formula. Nowhere has there ever been such a bold reversal. Nowhere has there ever been anything as terrible, as questioning, as questionable as this formula. It summons a reevaluation of all the values of antiquity. It is the exaction of revenge of the Orient, the deep Orient. It is the taking of revenge of the Oriental slave on Rome and its elegant and frivolous tolerance, on the Roman Catholicity of faith. And never was it the Roman faith that enraged the slave. It was rather the master's absence of faith, that half stoical and smiling unconcernedness in contrast to the slave's earnestness of faith. Enlightenment is enraging. The slave wants precisely the unconditional. He understands only tyranny, even when it comes to morality. He loves as he hates without nuance into the depths, to the point of pain, to the point of illness. His many hidden sufferings rage against the elegant taste that seems to deny these sufferings. Skepticism about suffering, fundamentally nothing more than an aristocratic attitude, contributed in no small part to the origination of the last great slave rebellion, which began with the French Revolution. Paragraph 47. Wherever on earth the religious neurosis has appeared, we find it bound up with three deadly dietary prescriptions: solitude, fasting, and sexual abstinence. Without being able to decide with assurance what is the cause and what is the effect, and whether there is even a relationship here between cause and effect. This final doubt is justified by the most regular symptoms among people, both savage and tame, including the wildest kind of voluptuousness, which suddenly transforms into a spasmodic repentance and negation of will and world. Perhaps both are interpretable as a masked form of epilepsy. But it is precisely here where interpretation should be gotten rid of. Around no other type of person has such a profusion of nonsense and superstition grown as around the religious type. And no other type has been more interesting to people, even to philosophers. It is high time to be a little cold, to learn to be cautious. Even better, look away, go away. Even in the background of the most recent philosophy, the Schopenhauerian philosophy, there stands almost as the problem itself, the dreadful question mark of religious crisis and awakening. How is the negation of the will possible? How is the saint possible? This seems to have really been the question that made Schopenhauer a philosopher. The question with which Schopenhauer began, and so it was a genuinely Schopenhauerian consequence that his most committed disciple, perhaps also his last, as far as Germany is concerned, namely Richard Wagner, ended his life's work precisely at this point and finally brought about that terrible and eternal type on the stage as Kundry, tout vécu, received type. As he loved and lived. At the same time, the psychiatrists in every European country had the opportunity to study up close the religious neurosis, or to use my language, the religious essence. As the Salvation Army, its last epidemic outbreak. If anyone were to ask what is really so exorbitantly interesting about the phenomenon of the saint to people of all kinds, to people in every age, it would have to be without doubt the apparition of miracles, which are always attached to the phenomenon of the saint. Miracles, that is, the immediate succession of opposite states. States of the soul that are morally valued as antithetical. It seems palpable that a saint, in quotes, a good human being, could be made out of a bad human being, The earlier psychology shipwrecks at this point. Shouldn't this really have happened because of the installation of the hegemony of morality? Because they really believed in the morality of opposing values, because they saw such oppositions in the text and in the state of affairs, because they read them into the text and state of affairs, because they interpreted them into the text and in the state of affairs. How could this be? The miracle as an error in interpretation, a deficiency of philology. 48, it seems as if Catholicism belongs to the Latin people more inwardly than the whole of Christendom belongs to us Northerners. For this very reason, unbelief in Catholic countries should be interpreted quite differently than it is in Protestant countries. Namely, unbelief in Catholic countries is a kind of infuriation, a kind of enragement toward the spirit of the people. Whereas for us in Protestant countries, unbelief is a kind of return to the spirit or unspirit of the people. We Northerners come doubtless from the barbarian people, even with respect to our aptitude for religion. We are poorly equipped for religion. The Celts should be excluded from this, for they have given the North the most fertile ground for the Christian infection. In France blossomed the Christian ideal, as far as the pale northern sun would allow it. How strangely pious do even the most recent French skeptics seem to our taste, insofar as some Celtic blood is within their lineage. How Catholic, how un-German to us is the stench of Auguste Comte's sociology, with its Roman logic of the instincts. How Jesuitical is Sainte-Beuve, that charming and clever Cicerone from Port Royal. Cicerone means poor guide. Cicerone means poor guide. Despite all of his enmity toward the Jesuits, and indeed, un renan, how inaccessible to us Northerners is the language of this renan. His voluptuous soul, voluptuous in the more sophisticated sense, in a more sophisticated sense, lying comfortably in his bed, would be disequilibrated in a single moment by some nothingness of religious intensity. Recite just one of these lovely sentences, and what malice and arrogance throb in our souls. In response, our souls are German and therefore probably less lovely and more severe. I'm going to have Simone recite for you this passage, which is written in French. Alors, Simone.
Disons donc hardiment que la religion est un produit de l'homme normal, que l'homme est le plus dans le vrai quand il est le plus religieux et le plus assuré d'une destinée infinie. C'est quand il est bon qu'il veut que la vertu corresponde à un ordre éternel. C'est quand il contemple les choses d'une manière désintéressée qu'il trouve la mort révoltante et absurde. Comment ne pas supposer que c'est dans ces moments-là que l'homme voit le mieux?
Let me do my best to translate this. So, let us say then, I don't know if you can hear me though. You might not be able to hear me. Hold on, I'm sorry. I want to make sure that you can hear me. Can you hear me? I hope you can hear me. Okay, let me try to translate this into English. Let us say then, boldly, that religion is a product of the normal human being. That man is most in the truth when he is the most religious and the most assured of an infinite destiny It is when he is good that he wants virtue to correspond to an eternal order. It is when he contemplates things in a disinterested way that he finds death revolting and absurd. How not to suppose that it is in these moments, in such moments, that the man sees the best? Well, that was the best that I could do. That was the best that I could do. Merci, Simone. Merci bien. Thank you, Simone, for reading that in French. But to get back to Nietzsche, in my English translation, these sentences are so very antipodal to my ears and tendencies that as I read them, I wrote in a rage in the margins, I'll do my best to pronounce this in French, la niaiserie religieuse par excellence, the religious silliness par excellence. Until my wrath turned into fondness for these sentences, which put the truth on its head. It is so elegant, so distinctive to have one's own antipodes. Paragraph 49. The most astonishing thing about the religiosity of ancient Greek culture is the untrammeled plenteousness of gratitude that emanates from it. Let me read that again. The untrammeled plenteousness of gratitude that emanates from it. This is a highly distinguished type of human being who stands before nature and before life. Later, after the mob gained ascendancy in Greece, fear overgrew everything. Even religion and Christendom waited in the wings. And Christendom waited in the wings. 50. The passion for God. These are the rustic, true-hearted, and impertinent types, like Luther. The whole of Protestantism dispenses with a southern delicatessa. There is an oriental ecstasy within this passion for God, as if it were the ecstasy of a slave who had just received an undeserved pardon or an undeserved elevation in status. An example thereof is St. Augustine, who had a disgusting lack of good taste in his gestures and his desires. There is an effeminate tenderness and desirousness within this passion for God, a bashful and unknowing yearning for an unio, mystica e physica, a mystical and physical union. As we see in Madame de Guion. Let's move on now to 51. Until the present day, the most powerful people have bowed with reverence before the saint. The saint, that riddle of self-mastery and deliberate, final self-renunciation. Why have they bowed down before the saint? They suspected that there was a superior force at work within him beneath the question mark of his fragile and abject appearance. They suspected that this force wanted to test itself by mastering itself. They suspected a strength of will in which they recognized their own strength and lust for domination. By honoring the saint, they honored what was within themselves. Moreover, the image of the saint raised the following suspicion. Such a monstrosity of self-negation, such an anti-natural thing could not be desired in vain. That is what they said to themselves. That is what they asked themselves. Might there be a reason for it? Might the ascetic have received news of a terrible danger in private from his messengers and visitors? Enough! The powerful leaders of the world learned from the saint a new fear. They sensed a new power within him. And this power was perceived as an alien, still unconquered enemy. It was the will to power that forced them to stand frozen before the saint. They had to pose questions to him. There's a motorcycle outside. Paragraph 52. In the Jewish Old Testament, in quotes, those quotation marks are important, the book of divine justice. There are people, things, and speeches in such a great style that there is nothing comparable in any of the ancient Greek or Indian literature. One stands in terror and awe before such a monstrous remnant of what humanity once was. And one only disconsolately reflects upon ancient Asia and upon that little European semi-island which supposedly signifies human progress. Indeed, this is a slight mistranslation. Indeed, someone who is nothing more than an emaciated house pet and who only knows house pet needs, like our educated folk of today, like the Christians of educated Christendom, will find nothing astonishing, much less distressing in those ruins. The taste for the Old Testament is a touchstone for all reference to the great and the small. Perhaps he will find the New Testament, that book of grace, much closer to his heart. There is much therein that stenches of that real, tender, damp, true believer, small soul smell. To have taken this New Testament, a rococo of taste in every sense, and have pasted it together with the Old Testament, and to have formed a single book out of both, calling it the Bible, the book in itself. The book itself. This is perhaps the greatest presumption and sin against the spirit that literary Europe has on its conscience. 53. Why atheism today? God as the Father has been thoroughly refuted, not to mention God as the judge and God as the Redeemer. The same thing could be said of his free will. He doesn't hear anything, and if he did, he wouldn't know how to help anyway. The worst is that he seems incapable of communicating himself clearly. Is he unclear? Having asked questions, having listened, having researched in many different languages, these are what seem to me to be the causes of the decline of European theism. The religious instinct is indeed growing vigorously. However, it denies theistic gratification with the deepest mistrust. 54. What has the whole of contemporary philosophy really been doing since Descartes, and truly more in spite of him than because of him, all philosophers have attempted to assassinate the ancient concept of the soul under the pretext of a critique of the subject and a critique of the predicate. That is to say, it would be the assassination of the fundamental presupposition of the Christian doctrine. Contemporary philosophy, understood as epistemological skepticism, is implicitly or explicitly anti-Christian, though for the sake of more sophisticated ears, it is by no means anti-religious. Formerly, people believed in the soul in the same way that people believed in grammar and the grammatical subject. One said that the I is the condition, and that think is the predicate and condition. Thinking is an activity to which a subject must be conceived as a cause. These days, with an admirable tenacity and cleverness, people are experimenting whether they can escape this net, whether perhaps the inverse is not true. Perhaps think is the condition, and I. Did I say that right? Let me say that again. Perhaps think is the condition, and the I is the conditioned. The I is therefore a synthesis that is constructed by thinking. Kant wanted to prove that the subject cannot be proven by the subject, nor can the object be proven by the object. The possibility of a phenomenal existence of the subject, thus the soul, might not have been always foreign to him, a thought that once appeared on earth with extraordinary power as the Vedanta philosophy. My empirical self is merely an appearance. It's not my true self. Lastly, let me now read for you paragraph 55 on religious cruelty. Paragraph 55. Religious cruelty is a long ladder with many steps. However, there are three of them which are the most important. Once human beings make sacrifices to their God. No. Once human beings made sacrifices to their God, perhaps sacrificing even those whom they loved the best. To this belongs a sacrifice of the firstborn in all prehistoric religions, including the sacrifice of the Kaiser Tiberius in the Mithraic grotto of the island Capri. That most terrifying of all Roman anachronisms. Then, in the moralistic epoch of humanity, people sacrificed the strongest instincts that they possessed to their God, their nature. This festive joy glimmers in the cruel gaze of the ascetic, this exalted anti-naturality. Ultimately, what is there left to sacrifice? Isn't now finally time to sacrifice anything that brings comfort, everything sacred, everything that heals all hope, every faith in an obscure harmony or in future felicities and justices? Isn't it finally time to sacrifice God itself, the God itself, and in an act of cruelty against oneself worship stones, worship stupidity, worship heaviness, worship nothingness? To sacrifice God for the sake of nothingness, this paradoxical mysterium of the final cruelty has been reserved for the generation that is approaching. We all know about this already. Well, thank you very much. I just read for you paragraph 45 onto paragraph 55 of my English translation, Beyond Good and Evil, Prelude to a Philosophy of the Future, by Friedrich Nietzsche in the German original, Jenseits von Gut und Böse, Vorspiel, einer Philosophie der Zukunft, by Nietzsche. This is video 5. It's video 5. In my 15-part video series in which I recite for you my English translation and lecture on the text from time to time. I hope that you benefited from it. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I hope that you will continue to watch and listen to these videos. I've put a great deal of time into them, a great deal of care, as I hope you've noticed. And I do hope that you benefit from them. This is Joseph Suglia, once more, Suglia, signing out and signing off. Thank you very much. Goodbye.